Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of the July STC Roundtable. Today's panel discussion is presented by Tony Rozier, Fabrice Lacroix, Sarah Feldman, and Lois Patterson. Tony, I will now turn it over to you.
Well, I started talking without unmuting. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. We're going to be talking about the future of machine-readable content, and very specifically, we're going to be focused on the formatting of content, talking about structured content versus NLP, and maybe any other types of formats that may pop up in our lively discussion here. So the first thing I want to do is to introduce our panelists to you. I'm going to have them introduce themselves, but before I do, I want to say thank you to each of them for being here. I'm really happy that you all said yes. I know each of you either through conferences or working together, or in one case, just a lot of LinkedIn discussions, Lois. And I know that you're experts in your fields and in this realm, particularly Lois, developer docs for voice interfaces, and she's going to introduce herself. Fabrice is the best structured content person I know, and Sarah is our resident knowledge base expert. So why don't we start with you, Sarah? Can you introduce yourself and tell us, about what you do?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today. And my experience is primarily in technical communication and knowledge management. I've been doing that for more than 10 years and primarily focused on customer support or online self-service for customers. And I'm currently the content experience manager for MindTouch, which is a SaaS knowledge management platform.
Okay, thanks. Fabrice?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I'm the founder and CEO of a company named Antidot, and our flagship product is Fluid Topics, which is a dynamic content delivery platform. So our mission is to aggregate any type of content that a company has and put that, make that accessible, findable, and feed the different touch points and channels so that people find the info they need at the right time in the right format.
Okay, thank you, Fabrice. And Lois Patterson.
Glad to be here. I'm currently focusing on technical documentation for voice interfaces, voice assistants particularly, and I have a strong interest in conversational design, in natural language processing, and the whole voice assistant to human interface.
Okay, thank you, Lois. That's interesting. I hope you're going to tell us some more about that. So guys, before we get started, I've asked our panelists if they could just give us kind of some basic definitions, because probably most of us here are familiar with structured content, and we're probably even familiar with natural language processing as far as terminology. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I've asked Sarah, would you start and just give us a, kind of a basic definition of what you see as structured content?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be interested to see if Fabrice has anything to add on this topic in particular. A quite simplified definition is that structured content is content that's organized in a predictable way. It's usually classified with metadata and other semantic rules, really for the purpose of to allow machine processing. Another way to think about it is treating content almost like data. It needs to function in a way that data can. And I do want to distinguish the difference between structured content and structured authoring or topic-based authoring, which is also very common in our industry. And that's your method to define and enforce consistent organization of your authoring content. And that's where you hear about XML authoring. DITA is probably the most well-known version of that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for making that distinction. Appreciate it. And Lois, you're the resident NLP person. Can you give us all kind of an elementary definition of what natural language processing is?
Well, natural language processing is what makes voice assistants tick, essentially. It's taking the unstructured inputs of humans who tend to fail to speak in predictable ways and making sense of it. So it will take a string. The audio conversion is not really what we're discussing here, although that's very interesting on its own. but it will take a string of content, and once it's interpreted what the words are, it does various things to that string. For example, it'll look at a verb and reduce it to its infinitive form. It will take a look at verbs versus the activities that are that want to be done. So generally what we think of as a verb is translated into an intent, and then there's various nouns that relate to that intent, for example, that are called slots. For example, if you say, I want to book a flight from Seattle to San Francisco on Friday at 10 a.m., then book would be the intent, and then you have the various slots for the departure city, which would be Seattle, the arrival city, which would be San Francisco, the day of the week, which would be Friday, and the time of day, which would be 10 a.m. So it's a way of reducing the unpredictable human input into a specific structured format ultimately. And of course, there are a lot of different ways people can say the same thing, and that's where machine learning comes in, so that you can, so that the different ways people say something can be interpreted as meaning the same thing.
Okay, so it sounds almost like you're breaking sentences down into grammatical syntax. Is it somewhat like that?
That's correct. So what the most common thing that that I'm working with voice assistants is that we want to break what we call an utterance into intents and slots. And the intent, like I said, being the verb, and then the slots being the various nouns that make that intent take place.
Okay, thanks, Lois. Hey, Fabrice, I wanted to ask you if you can kind of place this into context for us, because you and I have had a couple of discussions. So what we're talking about today is basically that, as I see it, we kind of have two different camps here who are approaching designing content for machines in two different ways. We have what I would consider more the technologists, although Lois, you're definitely a content person who's working with the technology, but technologists who are developing natural language processing. And on the other side, tend to be mostly information people who are working with structured content. So do you agree with me that there seem to be like two different camps and they're approaching it from different ways? And how does that help us or hinder us?
I totally agree with that. And I like I like the definition Sarah gave at the beginning, making the distinction between structured content and structured authoring. Those are two different things. Structured authoring relates to fragmenting the content. So you work at a more granular level, which allows reuse, ease translation, and so forth. But fragmenting content doesn't mean that you've got a lot of semantics inside the content, which is very different, and which is where the other aspect, which is enriched content, which is something that you do with NLP most of the time, consists in taking that fragment of content, that stream of text, and then start looking into it and try to see what's inside the content itself. Can be at a linguistic level. So Lois was talking about grammatical analysis mostly, which is something required for voice assistants. They start doing some sort of a grammatical analysis of the phrase to extract the intent. But you can apply NLP inside this content to some, for example, see people's name, places, tools, product references. Can be anything that you try to discover inside. Can be dates, like for this example Lois gave. But if you look at tech content, maybe you don't have dates or towns like that, but you have tools, product reference, operations to be done, very specific instructions like tighten or do something, or see what I mean. So you try to tag that. So you try to go into the documentation and enrich and discover what's inside the text. So that's where, and that's very similar technology that is applied to go from the utterance to the intent, as Lois mentioned, which is one part of what voice assistance has to do, analyze the utterance, the dialogue, to structure the dialogue. And the same technology has to be applied on the text itself, so that you go from flat text to something that is more that is richer, and that becomes structured content in the way Sarah defined it. Now, the thing is that to run the algorithms, it's better to do that on fragmented text. So this is where structured authoring helps a lot, because those technologies works better on content that is on fragments of content that are about the same subject. See what I mean? Where it's very scoped content.
Mm-hmm.
So if you work at the more granular level to apply these sort of algorithms, you get better results than running those sort of algorithms on very, very large set of content, like classifying, tagging content. If you want to tag a book of 500 pages, that talks about everything. There may be things about installing, repairing, provisioning, deprovisioning. So saying that one book is about one thing is complex, but if you go down to the chapter, to the section, then say, oh, this is about provisioning, this is about installing. So this applies to maintenance, this applies to servicing. You have to go at the final level to be more specific about what this content is about. The larger the content, the more generic it is, and the more complex it is to run these algorithms in a very efficient way.
Sure. Hey, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about your input on that because, and one of the reasons I did ask you if you would come and talk to us today is because MindTouch, which is started out, I believe, as basically knowledge-based software, has also moved into the chatbot arena, which chatbots, there are various different kinds, and some of them will use natural language processing, and some of them will be more rule-based. So I was curious, and maybe that's not something you work with at your company, but maybe you could tell us, have you guys looked at structured versus NLP in the use of something like a text-based chatbot?
The people at MindTouch who could answer that last question you posed work in a different department. They're the engineering on the engineering team, so they're the ones that could speak to the technology comparison. But I can speak in general in terms of how we're looking at chatbots now. So MindTouch doesn't actually develop a chatbot at all, but it's a SaaS knowledge-based platform, as you talked about, knowledge management platform. So all of the content can be authored and published in this web-based platform. And there, without getting too into the weeds, there's kind of a hierarchy embedded in our product that is meant to organize content in a way that automatically sort of creates connections between different bits of content. So you can use it in a bunch of different ways, but we often recommend folks publish content more as you hear micro content or atomic content as terms out there. So like Fabrice was talking about, we don't recommend publishing one knowledge-based article that's worth 500 pages of a book, but one page for one sort of micro idea. And that ends up serving really well into chatbots, or Google is often one that we talk about that's really relevant to our customers.
Yeah, so, you know, most of us, I imagine, who are here today, when it comes to using whether a text-based interface or a voice-based interface, we're not interested so much in working on content for people ordering pizzas or booking flights. We are more interested in what you guys focus on at MindTouch, and that's something like a knowledge base, whether it be, you know, online or in our own systems or whatever. So, you know, Lois, maybe you could start by answering this and then you guys jump in, but how more complicated does it become when we have content that it's more narrative, like in a knowledge base, than if we have something like the intent of wanting to purchase an entity such as a pizza? How does it become more complex?
You do raise a very good point, because even though humans have a very diverse way of saying, a number of ways of saying the same thing, it is much simpler to capture the pizza buying scenario versus, say, the financial advisor scenario. But what becomes really relevant when you have, say, a financial advisor and a voice assistant is that someone has to carefully construct and think through the conversational design that the assistant and the human will be having. So although we are relying on machine learning to help us expand the ways in which the voice assistant will understand the human, that doesn't replace the need for very careful conversational design and also for testing. So the more complex the domain is, the more you are trying to capture conversational pathways that are not necessarily easy to anticipate, the more important conversational design is, the more important it becomes that your voice assistant can guide the user to provide the information that the voice assistant needs. So I think what people have to consider if they're developing that type of application is that it will require a considerable amount of design work. Just as with traditional software application, we have user interfaces. With a voice assistant, we have voice user interfaces, which are sometimes combined with the screen interface as well, multimodal. And there's no way to get around the fact that this requires a lot of upfront design work and a lot of user testing.
Sure. Fabrice, I suspect you have something to say about that.
I see that as the main challenge for voice assistant, because as Lois mentioned, it requires almost rewriting the content entirely to make it more fragmented and down to the phrase level almost, which is a challenge for many companies. I mean, if you sit on years of content writing and you have manuals for field servicing complex pieces of hardware, and you have hundreds of pages, thousands of pages. We have customers that have 500,000 pages of content. You cannot just ask them to rewrite everything in a conversational way. So which for me is the biggest challenge for all this voice assistant thing is that if you try to apply that to most of the industries where the products are very sophisticated, I mean, at least if you write tech content most of the times, because you have sophisticated products, and this is content written by humans for humans, okay, meant to be read by humans, and suddenly you say, okay, this is to be used by machine, and it's very difficult. I don't see many companies say, okay, we're going to rewrite these 2 million pages. It's gonna be fun, guys. Let's rewrite that in a conventional way. Nobody does that. So I see that as maybe the biggest challenge for this chatbot thing, because except for more B2C markets with like how do I my setup box or achieve some very specific easy things to do or order a pizza or use my phone, maybe you can rewrite part of your content because it's about 100, 200, 500 questions. And maybe that covers 80%, 90% of the questions of the people. Then it makes sense maybe to rewrite that because it covers somehow the most common questions and use cases that you have. But those are simple answers like how do I change my mobile plan or something like that. But when it comes to fixing a piece of heavy machinery, how can you rewrite content? I don't even know if it's possible. I'm not specialist in that, so I don't know. But maybe you've had some of you had this discussion with customers. How do you rewrite 500 pages of complex instructions for fixing a device into something that is conversational? I don't know that. See what I mean? That's where I see the biggest challenge.
It's a question that actually people ask me frequently because I have been working with chatbots for a couple of years, not voice-based ones like Lois, but more text-based bots. And they say, yeah, but what about when it comes to something, like a knowledge base, like what Sarah's working with? And to date, I've said to them, I don't know. I've tested and tested. But even with a pretty strong NLP system behind a knowledge base, I can ask a question and it will throw back at me something complete. I had the experience yesterday. I asked a question of a bot that was online for a platform that claims to have an intelligent system. And I asked, and it was a product page, and I asked, does your product work based on NLP? And the bot gave me some answer about something. I don't remember the response, but it was completely unrelated. Sarah, what about, I know that, that's not your domain, the NLP, but have you guys seen any use cases where people are using knowledge bases as the kind of the content resource for some sort of a conversational UI?
Yes, we do. We have some customers that use content that they publish in their MindTouch platform to feed into their chatbots, among other sources. That's an important thing. Your chatbot, obviously, most likely is going to need to be able to read from multiple sources or one sort of combined database. We actually, I think it's really interesting what we're talking about here about rewriting content for chatbots. My personal stance and kind of our stance at MindTouch is we think it's a little bit too soon to go all in on worrying about rewriting content for chatbots, because chatbots are the sort of current big craze. But if you look at how just IoT has developed over the last decade or so and what's likely to come, we focus more on capturing the content. It's more like voice of the customer and making sure that your content is findable, and findability is so much more than just SEO. It's making sure that it's capturing the right information in the right words that your users are looking for and understanding. So we focus more on that and authoring content in a way that is more extensible across the IoT and machine-powered devices that we know about now, and more importantly, the ones that we don't know about now or yet, because the rewriting thing is just, it's not going to be a way forward. So that's kind of our approach.
So you say both of you and Fabrice say the rewriting thing is not going to be the way forward. And I know that actually, Lois, you are more in the IoT space. So a lot of the writing that's happening in that space is new content, I would imagine. People are writing new content for IoT. So while you say it's not realistic to rewrite, if we take out the structure, if we take out the structured content or the NLP systems, do we still need to think about fragmenting that content though? Because most definitely most content these days is going into some sort of user, excuse me, there's a fly that's bothering me, some sort of interface that's very conversational, whether it be an IoT interface, which may not be so much conversational, or it may be, or it may just be informational. But are you encouraging your clients at least to start thinking about writing at that level? Sarah, you want to start?
Yes, I thought you were talking to Lois. Yeah. So one of the things that, yes, I agree with you that we can't rewrite, or we can't rewrite all of it. I like what Fabrice was saying, is there might be a point where we need to use analytics to rewrite some of the most important stuff, get to that 80%. It often doesn't take rewriting much of your content or looking at much of your content to hit that 80% in terms of how much it's used. But it's also more about thinking about word choice. So I can give a specific example. One thing that I remember when responsive web design first sort of became popular and mobile first design, there was a lot of talk about wanting to build systems that can dynamically replace the word click with the word tap, so that you write once and you can insert a variable for that click or tap word, and then depending on what device they're looking at, it would dynamically display the right version of that word. But I actually think we need to go beyond that and think about word choices and eliminate some signposting that we're used to in sort of long form content, so that the content can be chunked quite easily across devices. So phrases like see above or below, or having visuals and content that are dependent on each other as opposed to be able to stand alone. If you think about, visuals are important in content often, but at some point, depending on what type of device we're talking about here, you might have a visual only interface or a text only interface or an audio only interface. And so things like that, that's what I think is sort of the path forward for writing for the new content, not necessarily rewriting everything else, is thinking about our word choice and the relationship between the content and how it can stand alone.
Lois, do you want to weigh in on that? Because I suspect that with the type of work that you're doing, people are moving more toward writing that short structured content.
Well, certainly, I think there are some conversational design principles as to how long an assistant should speak. People obviously can't take in the same amount from the voice assistant speaking as they can if they were reading it on screen. So again, that goes back to really good conversational design and delivering exactly the information that the user wants at that moment. And if a lot of information is required, this again might be where multimodal is helpful, because if the voice assistant is combined with the screen, then the screen can be a place that you hold more information or show the user more information. And other things that you can do to make your application more efficient and to take advantage of these technologies is you have to make sure that you predefine all of the slots that are possible to define. For example, if you know that there is a list of cities, again, going back to the flight booking scenario, you will have a set of cities that the voice assistant compares against. So it's not comparing against all terms in the English language if it's in English, but against this particular list of cities. If it's a day of the week, of course, you will have a group, a set that's day of the week. And so as much as possible, you should look at ways that you can use predefined slots. Other things to consider, the way the user speaks may not necessarily be what the user is trying to say if, for example, they're using irony or sarcasm. And this is certainly an area where we have a long ways to go, but there's a lot of scientists, machine learning scientists, looking at how can we determine when utterance is sarcastic programmatically versus, of course, humans can generally detect it, but how well can a machine detect it? And the classic example is, thank you, XYZ Airlines, for making me late yesterday. And so the last thing you want to happen is that the airline will respond, oh, we're very glad to serve you, because they see thank you. So so there's a combination of things that have to look at the entirety of the utterance, and as much think of all the things that you can predefine in the response, and then make sure that the answers that you are providing are suitable for speech. And if you cannot provide that simple an answer, consider using multimodal and the assistance of a screen.
So
to provide further information.
It looks like we've lost Tony for a moment.
You're talking about audio. Hear me?
I think
we
we
hear
can.
Me? Now you can? Okay. Okay. So I want to ask you about a specific example that you used about cities, and you're talking about predefining cities and giving samples of cities. Okay, so I know that in NLP that works. For those of you who may not be familiar with that process, when you're creating something like a chatbot and you have an intent or an entity like a city, what you want to do is you want to give like a list of examples so that the machine learning can kind of learn based on that list of examples. Oh, this is a city, right? But what I want to ask is, moving over to you guys, Sarah or Fabrice, are we at that point, moving back to our original question, are we starting to move closer to structured content there and to some sort of maybe a hybrid between natural language processing and structured content? Question part one. Part two is, as a technical writer, I can't quite imagine writing content where I stop and define, like each and every or certain words in a piece of content. Fabrice, you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
First, then you, Sarah.
I'm going to mess the conversation. You're going to see. We used to talk about NLP. The problem is that with the recent evolution of technology, that means less and less. Let me explain. We used to do NLP exactly for what you described, like recognizing entity. It's called entity extraction. So recognizing dates, people, all those, or tagging content. And this was very close to grammatical analysis and all this stuff. And you could use technology like CRF, conditional random field, and stuff like that. And that was very close to NLP because in some way that was very related to the structure of the language itself. And nowadays, and it's very recent, we're applying new technologies which are basically deep learning based. So it's deep learning technology, and with deep learning it doesn't work the same way. You don't have a layer for doing grammatical analysis and then doing entity extraction or whatever. You just have a target goal, like you want to do something, you train your neural network, and it does what you need. But you don't know it does that. You don't have to do entity extraction. You can train for entity extraction, but if your goal is to train your, I don't know, if it's to train your chatbot to detect irony, you can do that nowadays. You can do that with neural network, but it's called NLP, but it's nothing related to language. It's just learning. So that's where the frontier is blurring now, because what used to be NLP, using legacy standard, well-known technology based on grammatical or somehow different technology for analyzing language, when you start using deep learning on that and deep learning, you can achieve goals that are different, like detecting irony, detecting still doing whatever you want to do, but it just does the job. And saying it's an NLP becomes a little bit, I don't know, it's just achieving what you want to do, and you have to train to do something. So that's where those new technologies are somehow helping solving bigger challenges, but at the same time, you cannot say exactly that it's NLP. It's like machine-based translation. Just take translation as an example. It used to be very NLP-based, grammatical analysis, where's the verb, where's the noun, where's everything like that. And that was like that, very NLP. And now it's deep learning. It doesn't work like that. You just give a set of translated content and it learns. And somehow it translates, and it cannot even tell you where is the verb, where is the subject, that it's a noun. It doesn't tell you that. It just translates and it works.
It's more based on pattern recognition than it is on specific.
Yes. That it used to be. So that's where it becomes complex, because those new technologies are giving us more possibilities, but it's not pure NLP as well, because you cannot go into this module, this neural network, and say, where is the layer where it recognizes the verbs? There is maybe no layer inside your network that says, this is where I detect the grammatical structure, and then it doesn't work like that anymore.
Sarah, did you want to comment on that? Because I saw your head moving when Lois was talking.
Yeah. So it was that, and something you said. I agree with everything Fabrice said, of course, and that actually quickly goes out of my domain of knowledge. But I can speak back to something you said, Tony, about you can't expect a tech writer to stop and sort of pre-define or pre-list out a comprehensive list of all the possibilities. So a couple solutions to that. One is what Fabrice was talking about, with we're getting access to more technology that can do the pattern recognition where that's not going to be necessary. And another thing that we look at in the knowledge management space, there's a particular methodology, as an example, knowledge-centered service, or KCS, is a methodology that some MindTouch customers use, and we focus on it a bit here. And the idea is that you're creating content that is demand-driven, and actually demand-driven is almost a synonym for that sometimes negative sounding word of reactive instead of proactive. Now, of course, we'd like all of the information to be available proactively, but that's not reasonable at scale. And so if you actually put methodologies into place and systems that can support demand-driven real-time knowledge capture and publishing, then you sort of eliminate the need to be comprehensive ahead of time. And that's, again, with new technologies, making sure that, and I know Information 4.0 Consortium looks at a lot of this, that your methods for capturing and publishing information need to be dynamic and ubiquitous and instant database refreshes, instant indexing. So some of the old school methods of long re-indexing processes used to happen sometimes once a night or once a week, right? We've moved way beyond that. So you need the technology to evolve. The technology is evolving to allow for this pattern recognition and instant content availability injected to wherever the customer is in any of those IoT devices or what have you. And it can be demand driven if you have the sort of response in place.
So to give, I think what you're talking about, a more specific example, correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about there are customer service systems out there now where when the customer feeds information into the communication loop, whether it be through a complaint or a question, into a chat or whatever it be, the system captures that and somehow intelligently, using some pattern recognition, some machine learning, it puts it back into the communication system going out, whether that be email responses, knowledge base, or some sort of a chatbot or a voice-based system. You're talking about something like that, right?
Yes, I am. And one important element that you didn't mention in what's involved there is the humans, which are still very relevant in this equation. Our jobs are not eliminated yet. There's a lot of human intervention to make sure that the right information is being captured and shared back. So, of course, making sure PII is not included in information that's reshared, that the information that's being captured and pushed out pretty instantly to the wider audience across your ecosystem is what's relevant to your wider audience.
So Fabrice, you kind of pushed us in this direction. I mean, we started out talking about NLP and structured, but you've kind of pushed us in this direction, and Sarah followed up that we may be going even beyond that. We're just talking about neural networks and machine learning that can actually capture content for us and recognize it, do pattern recognition, do some language processing on it in order to send information.
Last Tony.
Back out. So what does this have to do with structured content? I mean, are we going to completely lose the need for it, or what do you guys think? Who wants to go there?
I would say that's a tough question. Do we need structured content? I would say yes. So I would say definitely, because considering the maturity of technology today, the more you can give in the inputs, the faster you train the system, with you reduce the error margin, and as well as the volume of content that you need for training. So basically, structure helps a lot because it helps raising ambiguity. So that helps training machine in an easier way, definitely. So yeah, structured content helps a lot for training machines.
Lois, can you respond to that? Based on your experience?
That's probably more for the machine learning scientists on the side of my organization. But again, if we can think of ways that we can use context to make sense of the user's utterance, there's a lot of different factors. Like one example that I have documented involves the use of dynamic entities. What one person means when they say add milk to my shopping list differs from what another person means when they add milk to my shopping list. Because we can tell from contextual clues that maybe the first person wants full fat organic of a specific brand and the other person wants generic skim milk. That's just a simple example of how you can use context to determine the actual meaning of an utterance that is otherwise identical. And getting back to what Fabrice is talking about, I think he's talking about the use of supervised models, unsupervised models, and how unsupervised models are becoming, unsupervised models of machine learning are becoming very useful for this type of analysis. So on the one hand, as as we know from systems from the 1950s or so, there were rule-based systems like the psychotherapist Eliza, where she was just programmed to ask specific questions based on what the user said and pick up on one word, all the way to completely unsupervised models, which is what Fabrice is talking about, deep learning that does not require actual human analysis. You provide it with content that, as we used with the example of translation, that you provide it with examples of the original of translated content, and the neural network can learn from that. So in general, though, I think we can't say that one specific approach is going to work best all the time. In my experience, it usually requires a degree of experimentation to determine what's going to work best in constant iteration.
Okay. So before, I'm going to ask you guys one last question because we're about 20 minutes before the hour, and I want to leave our attendees here time to ask questions. So I'm speaking to you guys out there. If you have questions in your software, your video conferencing software here, you have a question pod, right? And you have a place to type in a question. We don't actually have a chat feature in this, but there's a question. So if you guys have questions, go ahead and start entering them now if you want to ask something of one of our panelists. And while you're entering your questions, I'm going to put one final question to you guys. And that would be something along the lines of, so what is the best case scenario for the future? I think for our audience, one question I really would like for us to try to give our opinions on, not necessarily answer, is, are we going to need structured content? Should we still keep structuring and classifying our content? But more importantly, in the future, what do you see happening with the way machines are reading content? And what do we need to be doing with our content to prepare for that? Sarah, I'm going to start with you because on my screen, you're at the top.
Excellent. I think we need to be preparing, such a broad question. So I'll repeat something I said before and then extend it forward. So I want to reiterate how important I think it is that we rethink our specific word choices and how transportable they're going to be across devices when it comes to content, and thinking more in that content excerpt or snippet mentality, no matter how you're authoring right now, we want to start thinking about how our word choice is going to be useful across devices. And then looking towards creating our content ecosystem so they are flexible. I think the reality is that we're likely to have instances where machine learning and NLP is going to have relevant roles, as well as structured content, and building out our systems and our processes so that they are flexible to accommodate both of those methods. Okay. Lois, do you want to weigh in?
So the way I would look at it is that I'd say the way that my team is looking at it is more, how can we bring structure to content that definitely isn't structured? So it comes down to the same thing perhaps, because ultimately we want the content to be interpreted in a way that is structured, even if the inputs that we get are unstructured. So one way or another, whether you start from an unstructured content, you want to end up with some type of content that has some structure to it. So I look at it from both perspectives. Can you create structured content? Yes, I think that will help, just like Fabrice was talking about. But also, what are the technologies that will make unstructured content structured?
Interesting, because our users are not going to be structuring their content before they put it into a chat interface, correct? Fabrice, what do you see coming? What is your ideal situation, or what do you think you see happening?
Sure. I think very much like Lois, we are working intensively on structuring content. But we have a use case. We have few use cases in mind, and as we discussed today, the chatbot is not an easy one. I mean, short-term chatbot that works on any content for any question is very difficult to achieve. So we are targeting different use case, other use cases than that. And I give you an example, very simple one. We see many problems where people read the tech doc, follow the steps, and still that doesn't work at the end. And you know why? Because usually they miss one step. So they read the list and they skip one step. They read too fast. And so it's not working. And that's most of the premise there. So for example, here you can put structure and you can then help them read the content and make sure they go through every step. So it's assisting people, guiding people in how they read content by putting the structure inside the content. If it's not existing, doing that automatically, that then can drive an interaction where you make sure that when they're executing a task, they don't miss a step, they do all the things one by one after the other. And that sort of things are much more achievable and creating a lot of value, for example. So it's putting the structure, but doing that in a way that we can solve things that are maybe less ambitious than the perfect chatbot, but can create values to the users, like helping them execute perfectly a service task, for example.
I think Sarah, actually, that's a good point. And Sarah made that point earlier that, that MindTouch is not throwing all of their eggs in the chatbot basket. We know that in the last 2 years, with the explosion of systems like Alexa and Google Home and things like that, everyone's thinking about, voice interfaces. But we do have a lot of other use case scenarios to think about as well. I know some companies are moving for technical information. Some of them are even moving to augmented reality and mixed reality type interfaces. And, we have to think about content structure for those as well. I do have a question here. If any of you others have questions, please go ahead and put them in now. This is from Douglas. What sort of input do you use for an unstructured learning case? Can I put in my 500,000 pages of HTML content into an unstructured deep learning network and obtain pattern recognition, or do I need to obtain user support interactions? What do you suggest?
Well, that's a good question. 500,000 HTML pages, you feed that into a neural network. That does nothing, because you have to give some, if you want to train the neural network, you have to teach the neural network what you want to recognize. So part of this 500,000 pages maybe depend on what you want to achieve, but 5, 10, 20% needs to represent something that needs to be the pattern, needs to define the pattern. So you need to train the network. So it's okay, this page, this is okay, not okay, okay, not okay, whatever the okay means, like this is for this is for that. And then the system learns. But just putting 500,000 HTML pages into a neural network does nothing by default.
Exactly. What you would, in that sort of a situation, like he said, you need something to train it first so that it understands what the patterns are. Then what you can do after that with those 500,000 pages is that you can continue to train and refine by doing something like supervised learning, where you put that in, and as the machine puts out a response, you say, yes, that's a correct response, or no, that's not a correct response.
That's it.
So, yeah. Do you guys have another question? We'll take another question while we wait and see if anyone has a question. Do any of you want to comment on when I'm thinking about when he's talking about HTML? Any of you want to comment on the use of schema as a structure? Familiar, Sarah?
Yeah, schema.org. So that's should be just sort of considered a must-have, I think, when it comes to any sort of content or information that's getting web-based and to be ready to be machine readable. I think it's well established that that's a requirement. It's following the standard.
Yeah. So and and to be evidenced by Google adding support for schema just even in the last few months. They've upped their support for schema. For Fabrice, were you going to comment on that?
That's typical use case where NLP and these new algorithms work well. I mean, you're not forced to tag all your content manually against schema classes. That's something that is very easy to do with through machine learning. And it's even better because there are tons of content that are already tagged out there against schema, different schema vocabulary classes and entities. And you can use already trained system, pre-trained systems for that. So you don't even have to first start tagging your own content. You can train on any content already tagged. And there's something called transfer learning now, and you can use that as a first training, apply that on your own content.
There's something called what, Fabrice? I missed that.
Transfer learning. It means that you learn somewhere and you reapply elsewhere. So basically, you don't have to train necessarily on your own content. You can use content from someone else, web content, pre-trained, because it's pre-tagged. Lots of people have tagged their content on schema, especially on the web. And the system can be trained and learn looking at those examples that are not based on your content, and then reapply that on your own content, and just fine tune at the end the training system, and it works well.
Yeah. So I think what I hear you guys saying, and you guys we'll go through one more time and you tell me what you think, is that we know that machine learning is the way of the future, and that a lot of machine learning is going to handle even language for us, but that we have to be able to train those machines. And in order to do that, there has to be some type of structure. And there are a lot of different ways we can imagine that structure, but there would be. Sarah, yes? No? Yes?
Yeah, agreed.
Agreed. Lois, what do you think?
I would have to quantify this, but I think in principle it's possible that if you don't have structured content, you could arrive at the same end. It'll just be more expensive and time consuming. I think the advantage of structured content is the time and money that it will save you.
That's a very good point. Fabrice?
Yep, I agree. Exactly. The more tag content you have, the better it is to start. But again, many industries, many use cases have figured out that the problem now is not the technology. The technology is mature, deep learning, everything is available on the web. You've got all the algorithms. You can run that in the cloud. It's not the technology the problem. It's the data sets. Okay, the data is the value, not the algorithms anymore, not the technology. So basically, you need data for training the systems, and it costs a fortune. Creating data sets for training costs tremendous amount of time and money. So this is why now technologists and the academia are really investing this transfer learning thing I mentioned earlier, is how can you use systems that have been trained somewhere and sort of apply that training somewhere else to reduce the cost of learning. It's just like human. When you learn to do something in one domain, you're good at learning faster to apply knowledge in another domain. That's what transfer learning comes from. That comes from human. We see that human learns fast. You just need few examples to learn, usually, as a human. Again, versus machine that needs usually thousands, if not millions of examples to learn. So basically, technology is trying to do that. How can we use training systems that have been trained at doing something and reuse this training so that incrementally we retrain them at very minimal cost to do something a little bit different?
Mm-hmm. Now, are you saying that we do that on structured content? Are you saying that we still need to be adding structure to our content, or do you think it's gonna go away?
Maybe yes. My point is maybe yes. I mean, basically we are trying to reuse algorithms that have been trained at recognizing cats on the internet on images, and see if an algorithm that can recognize cats and dogs can now structure your content. You may
So
feel
for
that
the,
it's very,
yeah,
very distant, but basically that's what we're trying to do right now scientifically. But
exactly.
well,
Yeah.
there are some steps in the middle of that, as you can imagine. But that's
Mhm.
the idea, because for every use case you have to retrain a system entirely. I mean, that's going to be slow to make machine learning be productive.
Mhm.
So now the science is not trying to enhance those algorithms by themselves. They are good. Is try to see how the learning can be transferred from one domain to another one. So which means that, yes, at some point, the dream would be that you don't have to tag your content. Trained systems would be smart enough, trained on other use cases, but somehow that would apply well to tagging and structuring your content automatically at minimal cost.
So for the record, that's what I think. I think that structuring content eventually is going to become a thing of the past because the algorithms that are being developed now are going to do it all for us. So
Yep.
in the present, though, it's still very useful, right?
It is. Definitely.
Yeah. So we're not there yet. We're not quite there
No,
yet.
a few years still to go. So
Yeah. So look, we're right before the top of the hour, so we need to let everyone go. Sarah, Fabrice, Lois, thank you so much for coming today. I'm sure that those who've been listening in appreciate it as well. I know you guys are all busy. I appreciate you taking this hour out of your time to come and share some of your opinions, your expertise with us, and kind of help us all to get our heads around what tends to be a complicated subject. So
yeah,
thank you. And thank you all for
thank you all.
attending. Appreciate you also taking your time out of your day to come and listen to us ramble on for 50 minutes. Okay. So see you all. Thank you again.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Tony. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You.
Bye.